If you keep abreast of the world of mountain bikes, then you'll have noticed that there's this new plus bike standard that's been around now for around a year. Much like 29ers when they first came out, some people are trying to pigeonhole plus bikes into a specific type of riding or a specific type of bike. I wanted to see whether actually they're just as applicable to normal riding as, say, a 650B or a 29er are. Are they just another wheel size, or are they something which we can pigeonhole into a certain type or style of riding? So the idea of this test isn't to find the best 650 plus bike out there, but we want to put the wheel size in a range of different bikes and conditions just to see where it does and doesn't work. As such, the 4 bikes that are on test are all totally different, so we're not comparing them as such. So the first bike is the Rocky Mountain Sherpa. It's an adventure bike, but slightly different to the rest of the adventure bikes out there on the market, in that it's actually a full suspension bike. So you've got big wheels, you've got front and rear suspension here, helping you sort of cross a lot of ground very comfortably and very efficiently. The next bike is the Marin Pine Mountain. Marin have gone down a budget route here, so instead of spending money on a suspension fork to aid comfort, they've put big plus-size wheels in a rigid bike, just to sort of give that extra bit of control and comfort, without all the money and expense. Then we've got the Scott Genius LT 710 Plus. This is basically Scott's enduro bike platform in a longer travel mode with big plus tyres, to see whether big tyres really have a place in enduro. Finally, we've got the Mondraker Vantage RR Plus. This is Mondraker's forward geometry alloy trail hardtail, and we wanted to see whether plus tyres can turn what was previously quite a harsh hardtail into one which is a bit more comfortable but still retains that fast feeling. Bikepacking is perhaps not the most mainstream of activities, but there's an increasing number of people doing it, both in the UK and over in the US. The idea is you load up a bike with your camping stuff or your bivvying kit, head out into the hills and go and discover some amazing sort of countryside without necessarily hitting the gnarliest of trails. Rocky Mountain have built the Sherpa around this growing sort of trend, but as opposed to building a rigid bike, which many people use for simplicity, Rocky Mountain have decided that the Sherpa could be a fun bike, so they built it with 95mm of travel at the back and a suspension fork up front as well. The suspension action is a little stiff off the top, which means it's got a fair sort of platform for pedalling, but when it goes into that mid-stroke, it's a little wallowy before ramping up again at the end. What this means is when you're in more aggressive terrain, the bike can feel a little bit too soft and a little bit vague. Even though the Rocky Mountain is designed to be quite a fun bike, we did find that the slack seat angle puts you in a less than ideal pedalling position, especially on sort of longer climbs, and the 90mm stem is a bit too long for our tastes. We think Rocky Mountain have been quite brave with the Sherpa. They're definitely doing something different. If you're looking for a bike for maximum laughs, then this probably isn't the one. But if you are looking to disappear into the wilderness for a long time and you're happy to take the risk on a shock blowing or fork maybe sort of not being quite as reliable as a fully rigid bike, then this is definitely a comfortable performer which will get you out into the hills. £750 these days gets you a fair bit of bike, but there's usually some compromises, often with the gearing or especially the wheels and suspension forks. The rigid forks on the front are definitely the defining feature of the Pine Mountain, and it probably will put some people off, especially if you're into riding rougher terrain. Marin have added this plus tyre to the front and to the back to give a little bit more control and a little bit more comfort out of the bike without relying on heavy, relatively expensive suspension. The rigid forks do transmit a fair bit of the shock through to the handlebars, that's inevitable, but the high-speed buzz and the worst of those hits is kind of muted by these big tyres. That said, the Pine Mountain is definitely a bike which rewards smart line choice. We've ridden it on quite a range of trails, from natural cross-country on like muddy and peaty sort of moorland rides, and we've also ridden it down trail centres, and for sure by the end of like a long ride your wrists are aching a bit, but if you can spot the lines ahead in between the rocks or just gently lift the bike over those things, then you can actually get down the trails with quite a bit of speed and a fair bit of control. It's never going to be quite as good or quite as refined or quite as fast as a fully suspended trail bike. But if you want a simple bike that's a lot of fun and you're sort of quite smart about how you read the trails, then the Pine Mountain really is a good budget option. There aren't many fully fledged long travel enduro bikes out there with plus wheels. That said, Scott have done that with the Genius LT 710 Plus. With plenty of travel front and back and quite aggressively treaded knobby nick tyres, this is a bike which really benefits from being pointed down a hill and letting go of the brakes. You can go ridiculously fast along lines and then brake really late into corners. In the corners, the knobby nick tyres are fairly good. There's a little bit of roll when you're really pushing them, as they are quite a big tyre and you are running them at lower pressures, but there's actually loads of grip on offer. You just got to work out how to feel it and where to find it. Perhaps one of the problems with Plus tyres is that when you hit a square edge or a root or something, you get that undamped rebound because it's not controlled like a suspension fork is, and there's a lot more air in the tyre than a regular tyre would have. That said, if you want to sort of ping off roots and rocks, these Plus tyres really help you do that. So the Genius, while not perhaps the most refined ride, is actually a load of fun because you can find yourself popping off these rocks and roots all the way down the trail. One thing that stood out about the Genius was just how well it climbs. There's loads of traction on offer from the knobby nick tyre at the back, and combined with sort of the suspension and the reasonably good geometry meant that we had absolutely no problems tackling sort of the steepest and most technical climbs. I don't think we're going to see the top end of the enduro field racing these Plus bikes anytime soon. There's definitely a compromise with puncture protection. There's also a compromise with the slight feel of the bike in really technical terrain because there is that little bit of disconnect between the rim and the tread of the tyre. But if you're looking for a really fun and fast and involving ride, then the Genius LT Plus is a good option. So last year we tested the standard 650B Mondraker Vantage and we found that the box section aluminium sort of rear triangle especially was incredibly harsh, and it led to a bike that was quite difficult to sort of pedal along on rough terrain and also left you pretty battered after a longer ride. What Mondraker have done is taken quite an aggressive hardtail and made it even faster. Basically the way Mondrakers work is with their forward geometry, which is a long front centre, short stem, which means if you keep the front end weighted you get a lot of grip at the front. This lets the back end sort of do its thing, and on this Plus bike it didn't seem to matter what it was doing. It would skip around, but it would follow you wherever you were going. And you could quite easily follow sort of mid to long travel trail bikes down trail centre descents without any real problems. What the Mondraker also highlighted was the difference between all the tyres on test. So while we found that the Schwalbe tyres punctured relatively easily but had quite a good aggressive tread, the Maxxis Chronicle tyre has a really good carcass, but certainly in wet conditions, the low profile, easy rolling tread really doesn't offer that much grip. That said, when we've tested these tyres in dry, rocky conditions, they're absolutely brilliant. So for me, this is possibly my favourite Plus bike that I've ever really ridden. It's aggressive and it's fast, and you can really hammer down the trails really well. Obviously, you've got to make sure you've got the right tyre combo for the day, and as with the Scott, you should really be running them tubeless or with a Procore type system in there to stave off punctures. If you're looking for something which has a little bit less weight, a little bit less maintenance than a traditional trail bike, then this really is a good option. So these are kind of the 5 things that we learned from this test. First off, for me, I think Plus tyres work slightly better on hardtails than they do on full suspension bikes. This is because with a hardtail, you're getting so much more feedback through the frame because there isn't any suspension in there to take away sort of the vibrations and the impacts. So having those Plus tyres helps soften the back end. I also don't think they work brilliantly for super aggressive riders. You've got a big tyre with a big volume, and therefore there's a lot of tyre deformation, especially when you're riding really hard on sort of really steep terrain. If you're someone who gets really anal about your tyre pressures and how the front end of the bike feels, you may find them feeling a little bit vague. So the third thing we learnt from this test is that in really sloppy conditions where a mud spike on a normal tyre would be what you'd be running, Plus bikes don't really cut the mustard yet. You've got quite aggressive treads from, say, the knobby nick, but you've got a wider footprint with a lower pressure tyre. It doesn't dig in quite as well as a normal tyre does. So if you're riding a lot of like really slippy, slidey mud, as opposed to sort of the loose, splashy mud, then you might find that the Plus tyres don't work quite as well. The next thing is the way the tyres are built is really important. We had 3 different tyres here in this test. If we discount the WTB one, as frankly it doesn't perform very well, we see 2 different approaches to building a Plus tyre. Schwalbe have built one with quite an aggressive tread, which does help in sort of slippier, muddy conditions, but they've gone for a lighter weight sidewall to help keep the weight down. The compromise, of course, being that they're a little bit more puncture prone. Maxxis have got the EXO and the tubeless ready sidewalls, which helps give that little bit extra stiffness and tyre stability, but they've built a tyre with a lower profile tread, which doesn't work quite as well in sloppy conditions. And finally, perhaps the most important thing with Plus tyres is to experiment with tyre pressures. What works for you won't work with someone else, and what we really found was that changing the tyre pressures, even by half or 1 psi, made a massive difference to the feel of the bike. Have it too low and yes, you'll get loads of grip, but the vagueness between the rim and the ground is a little bit too much, and there is quite a lot of tyre roll. have the tyre pressures too high, and you end up with a tyre that pings and pops off rocks way too easily, leading to an undamped, sort of slightly uncontrolled feel ride. So you really need to experiment and be really precise with the way you're running them. So I think we're going to see a lot more plus bikes coming out over the next year or two, and I don't think there's any point in pigeonholing them into one type of bike or another. With a wider range of tyres and perhaps some more development on how the tyres are built, these could be just as mainstream as any other bike in the next couple of years.